okay?
Yep, that's fine.
Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ellen Goodwin, and I am Infrastructure Manager at New Anglia LEP, leading on all things clean growth. Today is the start of COP27. So as part of that, through the UK government's Community Renewal Fund, we are running a series of webinars, the first of which is this one today that Amy Coulter from Groundwork East will be presenting based on carbon literacy. Amy, I don't propose to say anything other than that. Are you good to go?
Yep, all good. Yeah.
Perfect. I shall hand over then.
Thank you. So yes, as you heard, I'm Amy Coulter, and I'm a lead sustainability consultant here at Groundwork East. I've been working at Groundwork for about 6 years, and within the sustainability sector for around 20 years, working with businesses and local authorities all around reducing carbon. So Groundwork East is an environmental charity. We work across the east of England, and I specifically work across Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk. And through that work, we deliver the Carbon Charter in partnership with Suffolk County Council. Next slide, please. So quick background to the Carbon Charter. Hopefully there might be some of you that are aware of the Charter already, or who are already members. So we support businesses to reduce carbon and reach net zero. We've been going for over 13 years and worked with 500 plus organisations. The Charter is an environmental award scheme and sustainable business network, predominantly for SMEs across Suffolk and Norfolk. Key to certification are carbon emissions reductions. So that's what we're always pushing for our businesses to reduce their carbon emissions. But alongside that is communication. So communicating to other businesses, to your own teams, on the topic of carbon reduction with the aim of sharing best practice and experiences. So last year we developed a carbon literacy course for our members and the wider business community with the aim of supporting our members to improve their communication and understanding of all the issues around carbon reduction, net zero. And we do that through our carbon literacy courses. So to date, we run about 6 courses through the Carbon Charter and trained over 70 individuals from a range of different businesses. Next slide, please. So as you'll be aware, and as Ellen just mentioned, this week world leaders are meeting for COP27 in Egypt. So it feels like a very appropriate point in time to be talking about carbon literacy and the carbon dioxide costs and impacts of everyday activities. So this webinar is going to introduce the concept of carbon literacy, what it means, but also hopefully contribute to your own carbon literacy as an individual and as a business person. So what do we mean by carbon literacy? It's defined by the Carbon Literacy Project as an awareness of the carbon dioxide costs and impacts of everyday activities, and the ability and motivation to reduce emissions. So it is quite a common term these days, and I'm hearing it sort of used increasingly in sort of everyday business talk. But it is the term carbon literacy and the training around that was or has been established by the Carbon Literacy Project, which is an independent educational charity, and that they were recognised at COP21 in Paris in 2015, and they've been training and certifying individuals and organisations since then. So our Carbon Charter course is linked and certified by the Carbon Literacy Project. Next slide, please. So why is this important? As I said, it's particularly relevant today because it's day 1 or 2 perhaps of COP27. And today is also Carbon Literacy Action Day. So we're bang on target with that. The Carbon Literacy Project has certified over 40,000 individuals since it started. And the way the process works is that organizations develop their own courses, which are signed off by the Carbon Literacy Project, which can then lead to formal certifications for the people who are attending those. In terms of organizations, they can also become a carbon literate organization at varying levels, bronze, silver, gold, based on how many of their employees attend the training and are certified as carbon literate. Next slide, please. So why is carbon literacy beneficial to individuals and organizations? Or to put it another way, why do you or your employees need to be carbon literate? Well, firstly, research shows that becoming carbon literate supports people to make significant changes and to achieve carbon savings. So the output of every certified course is that individuals make carbon reduction pledges, and these are estimated to save between 5 and 15% in carbon emissions. So secondly, communication. This is key to the carbon charter, as I mentioned, particularly when you get to the higher levels of award. And so it's vital that each of us are equipped to communicate on the topics around carbon reduction, climate change, be that in conversation or in the boardroom, on the shop floor, or via social media. So the carbon literacy training really supports people to feel confident in using key terms and understanding the key concepts. Central to the ethos of carbon literacy is also the idea of a shared responsibility. So that's a shared responsibility to take action to keep the 1.5 degree target of limiting global warming, to keep that a reality. And that's very much part of the ethos of carbon literacy. It's also about the tools. So the aim is, as I said, is to support people to become confident in talking about the issues, but also in taking decisions around reducing their impact on the climate. So it's also about encouraging us to start talking about climate change, giving people the knowledge to talk and communicate to people within their organizations and externally about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then finally, their motivation. So the people attending my courses often want to let me know how motivated they feel to make changes within their own organizations or within their home life. And I know that I felt this too. So when I attended my first carbon literacy course, I really felt, after that, I felt very positive about things and also had a sort of renewed level of motivation and a feeling of empowerment. So there are several benefits of the courses that we run. Next slide, please. Just briefly, I'll go through what the requirements are, the content is of a certified carbon literacy course. I'm not going to focus too much more on the courses themselves, but we'll be looking at some of the key impacts or key elements that we can discuss today. But just as an outline, these are some of the topics that we would cover in the courses. So we'd be looking at the science and effects of climate change, with an emphasis on understanding how this relates to your business or your organization. We would explore carbon footprints, how these are calculated, why these are important. And then we'd focus on identifying actions that we can take at home and at work to reduce our emissions and how these can have an impact, and also discuss how different actions relate to one another in terms of how they should be prioritized, and what sort of carbon reduction might be associated with different actions. We also look at how to set carbon reduction targets and to develop a carbon reduction plan and support your organisation to get to net zero. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is really going to focus a bit on this idea of jargon busting. And I just wanted to give you a feel of what's included in the course, but also, as I said, some sort of useful takeaways from the webinar. So I'm sure that over the course of this week in particular, we're going to be hearing news from COP27 in Egypt, and that some of these terms are going to be used. So before we start unpicking those terms on the slide, I thought it might just be useful to give a quick recap of what COP27 is all about. So COP27 is the 27th conference of the parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change. So the first of these was in Berlin in Germany in 1995, and there has been a COP nearly every year since then. So you'll probably remember a bit about COP26, which got a lot of coverage in the media when it was held last year in Glasgow. And the main theme then was to keep 1.5 alive. So that was the aim to keep global temperatures or to limit global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. It was also the first year that business had played a significant role within the conference. So previously the focus had been more on the signatory nations getting together to discuss and decide on things, but there was much more of a focus on business being part of those conversations. And I took this as a sign that that business is now seeing the potential benefits of being part of this of these discussions. So the key outputs of COP26 were agreements of phasing out fossil fuel cars and vans, some deforestation pledges, and also a commitment to cut methane emissions. And we'll talk a bit about methane in a minute. So it's likely that COP27, as it's the first time that it's been held in an African country, it's likely there's going to be a significant focus on mitigation, adaptation, and reparations for those countries who are suffering most from climate change. So for the most part, these are the less developed nations, which have had much less of an impact on global greenhouse gases and the production of those over the years since the Industrial Revolution. So a key topic will be how to finance this, the necessary adaptation and mitigation, as we're already seeing the effects of climate change, and we're not going to be able to avoid all of these. Also at COP27, the signatory countries will need to bring their own national targets and commitments in the form of NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions. So that will be interesting to see how they intend to achieve targets. Anyway, that was just a quick sort of whistle-stop tour or recap of the COPs, COP26 and 27. But as you'll see from the slide, I have picked three key concepts that we're going to be exploring in the course of the webinar, which are highlighted in bold there. So we're going to look at the greenhouse effect and greenhouse gases. I'm going to talk a bit about carbon footprints and then explore net zero a bit further. Next slide, please. So let's start by thinking about the science behind climate change and the evidence that we're seeing of this changing climate. So this image represents the change in average UK annual temperatures using colour. So each year has been given a colour, dark blue being the coolest and dark red the warmest. And so what's obvious from this is that the reds are on the right of the illustration in more recent times, and the cooler blues are on the left, nearer to that 1884 date. So I did read about a UN report yesterday that was published yesterday, which actually shows that the past 8 years were the hottest ever on record, and that the average temperature in 2022 is going to be about 1.15 degrees warmer. That's the global average, warmer than that pre-industrial average. So we can see that that climate change and temperature rises are already, unfortunately, occurring. Next slide, please. So what does this temperature rise mean? Well, the change in temperature has or leads to changes in the climate and changes to our weather patterns. So we are, as I'm sure you're all aware, we're seeing increased outbreaks of wildfires. I was in France in the summer and I saw a lot of damage had been done from wildfires, and motorways were shut and that sort of thing. We've seen unusual cold events. For example, Texas in 2021 had a very extreme cold snap, which they weren't prepared for at all. And of course, flooding that we've seen locally, but also on a more devastating scale elsewhere, such as Pakistan this year, where a third of the country was estimated to be affected by floods. So, for example, with the heavy rainfall events and the flooding, rising temperatures lead to warmer air, and warmer air can hold more moisture, and that leads to the more extreme rainfall events. And as we know, built up areas often have little ground available for water to permeate and drain away. So this can also exacerbate flooding events. So I think we're probably all aware that we are seeing that climate change is happening here and around the world. And over 97% of peer-reviewed scientific papers conclude that climate is changing due to human activities. So the science around it is pretty clear now. Next slide, please, Ellen. So one of the other key risks arising from global warming is the potential for sea levels to rise. Recent studies from climate researchers at the University of Copenhagen show levels could rise, sea level levels could rise by at least 1.35 meters by 2100. And that's under a worst case warming scenario. So this map shows some of the areas in our region which would be at risk from sea level rise. And this is based on a 1.3 meter rise. And you can model different scenarios using a coastal risk tool. But what's interesting to me is the extent inland or the distance inland that those areas affected by or potentially affected by flooding as a result of sea level rise. So obviously the red areas are those which are likely to suffer from flooding. Next slide, please. So what's causing this change in temperature? Greenhouse gases, which are contributing to the greenhouse effect. So you'll probably remember that the greenhouse effect is the natural process through which gases in Earth's atmosphere trap heat. So as I say, this is a natural process, but what's occurring now is that our activities are generating much higher levels of these greenhouse gases than in previous years, so prior to the Industrial Revolution. And therefore they're trapping more heat within the Earth's atmosphere. So each of the main greenhouse gases, and you can see them in this table, So that's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and also a range of synthetic gases, which are principally used in refrigeration. Those are the FCs there. You can see that at the bottom in the table. So each of these gases have a global warming potential, and this global warming potential, or GWP, is its ability, or the gas's ability, to trap extra heat in the atmosphere over time relative to carbon dioxide. So you can see from the table that the global warming potential of carbon dioxide is 1, whereas methane is 25 and nitrous oxide is 298. So they have different global warming potentials, meaning they're more or less potent in terms of global warming and the greenhouse effect. So in general conversation, we often refer to carbon emissions rather than greenhouse gases. And this isn't wrong or necessarily inaccurate, as there is a unit of measurement that takes into account the global warming potential of all these different greenhouse gases and puts them into an equivalent unit. So that's carbon dioxide equivalent, written as CO2e. So this allows all those emissions to be reported as a single figure. So it takes all the different greenhouse gases and lumps them together into an equivalent unit, and means that we are able to talk about carbon emissions. And what we usually mean is all of those greenhouse gases and the effects of all of those. Next slide, please. So moving on to have a look at carbon footprints. We're going to think about what the process is to calculate a carbon footprint, and also what carbon footprints can tell us and show us. So carbon footprint is defined as the total amount of greenhouse gases produced directly or indirectly by an organization, or it can be a person or an event or a product. And it is usually expressed in equivalent tons of carbon dioxide. So that's that CO2e again. So usually it's tons or kilograms CO2e. Carbon footprints are a really important tool within the Carbon Charter. So all of our members, when they join the Charter and start their assessments towards the Carbon Charter Award, will be required to calculate a carbon footprint. We support all of our members to do this on at least an annual basis, because we feel it's a really useful and important tool to measure our impacts, and also to allow us to manage that and reduce our carbon emissions. So there are various ways that you can calculate your carbon footprint. You can use online calculator tools, and we have one on the Carbon Charter website, which is free to use for any business, don't have to be a member. Or our Carbon Charter team can help you to set up a process for doing this in-house or calculate it on your behalf. So some of the key elements to consider when we're thinking about carbon footprints are the boundary of that footprint. So what does it refer to? If you're thinking of your organization, is it purely one site? Is it all of your activities? So perhaps several different sites and different parts of the business, or is it a whole group of different companies? So it's good to be clear about what you're going to include and what the boundary of that carbon footprint relates to. Time frame is also important. We recommend that you do it, as I said, at least annually. So our carbon footprinting looks at a 12-month period. That doesn't mean that you can't be monitoring within those 12 months, but that each 12 months you should calculate carbon footprint and review against the previous 12 months and look at how what progress you're making to any carbon reduction commitments and targets that you've got. And then finally, their activities. So this is about which elements of your activities you need to be including within that carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So if we think about these activities, what should a business organisation be including within its carbon footprint? So there is lots of guidance around, which is available to business, and it tends to classify emissions into 3 categories or 3 scopes. So on this slide, you can see across the top there, we have our greenhouse gases. I should say this is an image taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's quite a famous image. I see it a lot around in my work, but I do feel it's quite useful as a reference when we're thinking about our carbon footprints. So if we start by looking at the blue arrow in the middle, Scope 1 direct emissions, this relates to fuel use in our premises and also company vehicles. So with our carbon charter businesses, we would be looking at, okay, you've got a site in Bury St Edmunds, for example, where you're burning gas for heating, space heating and hot water. You've also got a small fleet of company vehicles. So the fuel going into those, usually petrol or diesel, would fall under those Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2, which are there on the left, these Scope 2 emissions refer to the energy that you're buying in the form of electricity. So that's usually fairly straightforward, although you need to make sure you're including all the different supplies and that sort of thing. So those Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions form the basis of every carbon footprint for every business that we work with. And we would always expect to see Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. It gets a little more complicated with the Scope 3 emissions, which you can see are outlined there, coming from upstream activities and downstream activities. And I'm not going to go through every category there. There are 15 different Scope 3 categories, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But there are some key Scope 3 emissions sources which we would be encouraging our carbon charter members and the businesses that we work with to be including. So these are generally business travel. So that would be your employees' business travel in their own vehicles or on public transport, that sort of thing. It would be waste from your operations, from your premises, employee commuting mileage, and also transport and distribution, so upstream and downstream. So the transport and distribution that you're responsible for via third parties. And there is some quite useful guidance which has come from the government in a document called PPN 0621. And that looks at the requirements for organisations who are looking to become contractors to the UK government. And it outlines requirements for a carbon reduction plan and the elements which need to be included within a carbon footprint. So that's a useful place to start if you're trying to decide which of those Scope 3 emissions you should be including within your carbon footprint. Okay, next slide, please. So a very quick look at where we're going to get the relevant information to be able to calculate a carbon footprint. So we've got Scope 1 emissions will be coming from, as I said, those fuel sources, gas, oil, LPG consumption. So we'll be looking at meter reads or delivery invoices, and we'd want to get figures in kilowatt hours or meters cubed or litres, kilograms. We need to get those unit consumption figures, and then we would apply a carbon conversion factor. So the first step for any business to calculate its carbon footprint would be to get these consumption levels in these units, such as kilowatt hours, litres, what have you. Also within scope 1 there, the business vehicle fuel consumption, preferably in litres, but can be, we can use mileage to calculate that. Fuel card data and invoices are really useful for that. And then scope 2 there, electricity consumption at your premises. That would be coming from meter reads. We skipped there, I think. Meter reads and supplier bills, those sorts of things, and that would be in kilowatt hours. Next slide, please, Ellen. And moving on quickly to have a think about scope 3 emissions, you do need to be a bit smarter about how you get hold of the relevant information for scope 3 emissions within the carbon footprint, but there are ways and means of doing it. We've been doing this ourselves at Groundwork East, and also supporting lots of businesses to start reporting on their scope 3 emissions. So if we look at some of the key categories, we can see employee business travel in their own vehicles, and also commuting. So at Groundwork East, we ask all of our employees to submit an expenses form on a monthly or quarterly basis, which captures all the information about business travel, even if we're not making any expenses claims. But we also ask questions about commuting. So how do you commute, length of journey, what's your vehicle type, those sorts of things. And also working from home, because we're looking to include working from home within our carbon footprint. And then the other categories there, water consumption and waste. It's usually a question of either looking at supplier or contractor bills and invoices, or speaking directly to those suppliers to get figures relating to how much water you're using and disposing of, and how much waste you're generating. And then finally at the bottom there, transport and distribution. Particularly those upstream, so those are that's the transport and distribution that you pay for. You'd be hoping to get figures in terms of litres of fuel used or miles. This can be really tricky though, and so we do sometimes have to use estimates and averages and assumptions and those sorts of things. But just because you can't get accurate data on something, it's not necessarily a good reason to just exclude it from the carbon footprint. You're much better to use an informed estimate within your carbon footprint. Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked about a bit about greenhouse gases and carbon footprints. And another key term that we're hearing more and more is the phrase net zero. So around 90% of the global economy is now under some sort of net zero goal or commitment. And here in the UK, we are committed to achieving net zero by 2050. So net zero is a balance between the amount of greenhouse gas emissions which are produced and those that are removed from the atmosphere. So a credible net zero commitment needs to have a focus on reduction of emissions of at least 90%, if we follow that UN guidance mentioned there. And then the remaining 10% of unavoidable emissions can be offset. So this differs to the term carbon neutral, because carbon neutral has no requirement to reduce emissions. It can be achieved solely through calculating your carbon footprint and then offsetting the equivalent amount of emissions. In most cases, it just looks at carbon dioxide rather than all the greenhouse gases, but that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes carbon neutral can include other greenhouse gases. But the big difference is really that net zero has a requirement to be reducing your carbon emissions and to have some targets for these reductions over time, whereas carbon neutral can be achieved immediately through carbon offsetting. Next slide, please. So this image shows a typical carbon management hierarchy. So it's a bit like the waste hierarchy pyramid that you may have come across before. But it shows that the priority should be first to reduce emissions through becoming more efficient. So the way that we see our businesses doing this is usually through improving their production processes, making their premises more efficient, looking at lighting, so switching to LED lighting, and just making sure that nothing is being wasted in terms of energy and carbon emissions. Then the next priority is to invest in on-site renewable energy. So in most cases at the moment, this would be through installation of solar PV, photovoltaic technology, which is going to generate zero carbon electricity on site. And then following that, the priority would be to purchase renewable energy from suppliers or through investment in an off-site renewable provision. And then finally, to offset, carbon offset your unavoidable emissions. And so throughout all of this, we need to be considering how we can move away from fossil fuels, from burning stuff, as one of our Carbon Charter members referred to it to me earlier. So we need to stop burning stuff and move towards zero carbon energy use. So we need to be looking at how we can stop using fossil fuels and move towards electricity use, because using electricity for heating and transport is going to be or have much lower associated carbon emissions. And this is taking advantage of the fact that the UK electricity grid is continuing to decarbonise, so reducing the amount of carbon that each unit of electricity is responsible for producing. And there's an aim for the UK grid electricity to be zero carbon by 2035. So it really does play an important role in reducing those Scope 1 fossil fuel emissions and moving towards clean, green electricity in order to achieve that carbon reduction and net zero targets. Next slide, please. So as we saw, carbon offsetting can form part of a credible net zero strategy or commitment. It's essentially a way to compensate for your emissions by funding an equivalent carbon dioxide saving elsewhere. So this is usually through tree planting or land restoration projects, but it can also be through investment in renewable energy. So here are a few tips to ensure good practice when offsetting. So start offsetting now while simultaneously making emissions reductions. And that's really important, that you don't just offset emissions and then there we are, job done. So good practice would be to calculate that carbon footprint, set some reduction targets, and then think about how alongside those emission reductions, you can then offset those emissions you're not able to remove entirely. So as I've already said, net zero can use carbon offsets, but should be based on 90% reductions in actual emissions. You should only use certified offset schemes. So it's great to support, local woodland projects and those sorts of things. But if you're looking to be able to report on your offsetting and to show that you're reaching a net zero target, you're going to need to use a certified offsetting scheme. So examples of those are the Gold Standard, BCS, Verified Carbon Standard, and the Woodland Carbon Code, UK Woodland Carbon Code. And those are actually the only certified offset schemes which the Carbon Trust recognizes in the UK. So those are really the go-to schemes. And that doesn't mean that you can't go through a carbon offsetting company, but you just need to make sure that what they're investing in is to a certified level or scheme. And then finally there, you should aim to offset more than your carbon footprint. So if you calculate your carbon footprint and it's 100 tons of carbon dioxide, ideally you should try and offset 110% or 110 tons, just to make sure that you're sort of mopping up any inaccuracies or accounting for that. So you need to also watch out and try and ensure that your carbon offsets are doing what you expect them to do. So if you're doing your research, you need to consider whether that carbon offsetting scheme is actually achieving additional carbon reductions. Could that have happened anyway without your investment in it? It's also worth considering that if you're investing in tree planting, for example, you need to make sure that those projects are going to lock away emissions permanently. So you need to make sure that it's going to be well managed over time. Obviously, wildfires, pests, these sorts of things are going to mean that those emissions which were locked away are going to be released, and that carbon sink is no longer going to exist. So it's worth thinking about that and how that could affect the outcome of your carbon offsetting. You should also consider whether making these investment in carbon offsets is actually going to lead to other emissions elsewhere. And this is something that carbon offsetting has been criticised for. So, for example, if indigenous people living within a forest are actually required to move elsewhere once that is sort of bought up for carbon offsetting, what are the impacts of them having to move, not just socially, but also the environmental impacts of them moving to a different location? What are those impacts going to be? And then the key lookout really is that you shouldn't use carbon offsetting to delay making any carbon reductions or reductions of actual emissions. So I think that would be my most important point to raise in regard to offsetting. Next slide, please. So finally, a quick call to action. Please get involved. We do have a course running starting on the 15th of November via Zoom. And we do have a handful of places left. It's open to Carbon Charter members and non-members. There's a cost. It's £165 per delegate, with a reduction of around a third for Carbon Charter members. And we're not the only courses available. So if you can't learn with us, learn with someone else. But I would encourage you to think about supporting your staff, your team, to develop their understanding of the issues and develop ways to identify carbon reduction opportunities within your business. Next slide, please. So just a few quick case studies. We have worked with the Suffolk Building Society, who've been Carbon Charter members since 2018, supporting staff to identify ways to reduce their emissions. So there were a range of attendees, from those working in branch to those designing new financial products. As it says there, we had two full-day training courses, one of which was face-to-face in-house and the other via Zoom. And then we've also had several of their other key personnel attending our Carbon Charter courses. Next slide, please. Urban and Civic are a UK master developer. So the focus there is on the built environment. This wasn't actually through the Carbon Charter. This was a Groundwork East project. But we designed a bespoke course so that we could really think about the impacts associated with building and planning. So it also incorporated things like biodiversity and how that can link in with carbon reduction and carbon literacy. Next slide, please. And then finally, at Groundwork East, we have trained up all of our employees. So we've actually made it compulsory for all employees to attend carbon literacy training with the aim of becoming a carbon literate organisation. So that's when a large proportion of your staff are trained to this carbon literate level. And we have developed lots of new ways of measuring emissions from our project work and identified ways to reduce these. And it really did spark some really useful conversations within teams and between colleagues working in different areas of the business. So we really felt that was beneficial. Next slide, please. I won't go through that. Just to say, I think the key takeaway for most people is really the confidence it gives them in talking about issues to their friends, their colleagues, and also to identify practical steps they can take to reduce emissions at home and at work, and also to hear and discuss what other people are doing within their organization. Or when we have our Carbon Charter courses, it's lots of different businesses comparing the ways that they're tackling the challenge of carbon reduction. Next slide, please. So that's it from me for the presentation. I'm very happy to take questions now. I hope that you've picked up some useful tidbits of information, as well as finding out a bit more about the certified carbon literacy training. And if you do want to join one of our courses, you can either email me or have a look on the Carbon Charter website. And yes, as I say, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I can't see my screen, Amy. Oh, here we go. Stop sharing. Any questions for Amy? I presume there's a hand function, she says. There is a hand function. Amy, can I just say that was absolutely amazing. From a personal point of view, I know quite a lot, or I thought I knew quite a lot about all those bits and pieces, but that was really, really fascinating because it's really crystallized a few of those things for me and made me realize that actually there's still more that I can be doing and our business can be doing. So that's always good to kind of spark that kind of thinking.
Well, you're very welcome to come on one of our courses, Ellen.
I may well do that. Oh, there's no questions. Thank you.
What date in November is the course running? So it's running over 3 2-hour sessions on Zoom. The first is on the 15th of November, then 22nd and 29th. And you can just attend one or more of those sessions, but to be certified as carbon literate, you need to come along to all 3 sessions. So hopefully that's answered Julie Norris's question.
Bernadette wanted to know if we can share the presentation. I'm happy to. Amy, assuming you are.
Yes, I'm happy to, yeah.
Lovely, we can get that sent out to you all. That's not a problem at all. Any other question? I'll just wait just a minute in case there's anything else in the chat. I don't imagine there's going to be. It was very thorough, so I think it's food for thought. I guess I'll just wait and see if there's any more hands up or any more questions in the chat. But just so you guys are aware, this is the first of 6 webinars we're running. So we're running 6 over the 2 weeks of COP27. Feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is ellen.goodwin at newanglia.co.uk, or you can have a look on our Eventbrite page where you found details of this webinar. And we've got an in-person event next Tuesday on the 15th of November in Norwich, and if you wanted to attend that, there's still some places available there. But I think I just wanted to take just a moment to say thank you so much to Amy. Her colleague June will be presenting tomorrow how to make the first step change, I think. So actually sort of enacting some of this thinking in terms of carbon literacy and what you can actually do to effectively make that change. I can't see any other questions, and thank you.
I've just seen one more question, if that's okay, Ellen.
Oh, go for it. Yeah, of course, absolutely.
So, what capacity is there for Groundwork consultants to visit clients to help them with their carbon improvement work? So we do actually have a couple of funded programs running at the moment in Suffolk and Norfolk. So there is potentially the opportunity for a Groundwork consultant to come out and visit your business or provide, remote support through that. Otherwise, we do paid for consultancy as well. With the Carbon Charter, once you're a member of the Carbon Charter, you get ongoing support from our team of consultants as well. So there are certainly lots of ways we might be able to help. So feel free to drop me an email if you want to know more about those.
Miles, just so you know, I think you're based in Suffolk from memory. I think there's a little bit of consultancy left through a programme we're running, but I know that Suffolk public sector leaders are always also funding some consultancy through Groundwork, as Amy mentioned. So please do get in touch with me or Amy. Yeah, you're very welcome. No worries. I don't think there's much left in ours, but there's definitely some left from Suffolk.
Yeah, we do have. We do have some capacity for that funded work for Suffolk businesses. Yeah. So.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think that's everything. Just want to take a moment to say thank you very much again, Amy, and thank you everyone for attending today. Like I say, feel free to join any of the other webinars over the coming couple of weeks, and I look forward to hearing what comes out of COP27. But thank you very much, guys, and we'll be in touch soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So Ellen, are you happy or do you want me to PDF the slides and send them over to you? Or
I can do that.
Okay.
As long as you're happy with me doing
yeah,
I won't send
I'm happy with that.
Yep.
Yeah, I always just PDF it so they can't see my blah 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 notes.
I think that's always a good thing to do. And they can't change it then, just in case they wanted to make such changes. That was really, really good. Thank you so much, Amy. And like I say, I learned lots of food